welcome and thank you everybody for joining us now or later. um, so far we've had three quite different talks on community landscapes, top down and bottom up. Um, we've looked at 20th to the 21st public housing layouts in Sweden, which focused initially on people and then on cars, and examined one of these estates in more detail, where works plus refurbishment and new work, sorry, plus refurbishment and restoration was required in response to flooding, but a few things got lost since, I think. The second talk was a review of the rise of volunteers and charitable organisations, changes in UK legislation associated with EU membership, and the decline of public sector landscape architects. The last point, leaving the landscape profession in a weakened position, it felt. Last week's talk was in the Netherlands, looking at pioneering community work, creating ecologically driven landscapes from the 70s and 80s, with features that have become quite standard things now, like reed beds and green roofs and solar gain and all that. And working through different projects and initiatives and things, and then looking at one particular project where the facilitator had been involved for 30 years. And I think that continuity is a really important point. So this evening, we're really excited to welcome David Lambert, Being Awkward. So David is director of the Parks Agency, and he focuses less now on consultancy and more on his local community. He is a director of a community farm and is learning to be an activist, a milkman, a carer, a biodynamic gardener, and an undertaker. So over to you, David.
Oh, I'd forgotten I put it quite like that. Well, I'm happy to answer questions on anything, including learning to be an undertaker. It's very interesting stuff. It's nice to be here. I'm going to talk for sort of 45 minutes or so. I always think on Zoom, especially, it's quite, in the absence of the sort of chemistry that goes on in a live situation, it can feel a bit like talking to myself. So I'll certainly have got bored after 45 minutes or so, and we'll be really looking forward to hearing someone else's voice and voices. So good. Okay. So being awkward. I have to. So I've got a confession to make, really. I kind of changed my mind about this talk since I put together that proposal for Annabelle. We've all been lured in by it. I'm sorry if I disappoint you, but I will talk a bit about what I had in mind on that. I shall certainly talk about the way that community is a word that is abused by politicians, decision makers, planners, journalists, architects, possibly even occasionally landscape architects. And I want to talk about how I've seen communities experience being both welcomed and rebuffed, both included and excluded. But I also want to talk about something which I feel is in a way more urgent, I hope more interesting possibly as well for you. And that is community, and specifically community gardens, in a time of climate and ecological collapse, and I think unfolding societal collapse. I don't want to overstate things at this point, but it's shocked me deeply to read the Select Committee report from the Select Committee for Levelling Up, which held inquiry into the financial distress of local authorities, and 4 UK English local authorities have gone bust in the last 12 months, including Nottingham and Birmingham. Birmingham's the biggest in Europe. And the LGA, the Local Government Association, is reporting that nearly 1 in 5 council leaders believes it's fairly or very likely that they too will go bust in the next 15 months. So it feels to me like there's a crisis. You know, the crisis in local authority resources is coming to a head. So I want to pick up on that. However, being awkward. So first, I want to talk about the place of communities in planning and how they have to use their elbows to make room for themselves. In theory, communities are welcome everywhere in planning. Search any brochure for a major urban redevelopment project, and you would think they are centre stage. New community facilities, community hubs, the whole community, community infrastructure, community spaces, thriving communities, vibrant communities. Do you remember the gushing texts and beautifully rendered CGI for the Olympic Park? That same design required the destruction of the 83 allotments at Manor Gardens, which were founded in 1924. And any idea, and there was a huge and very well-run campaign that those allotments could be kept as part of the new landscape, as part of celebrating the existing community, was listened to politely by the master planners and dismissed. So for all the talk of community poured like treacle over every report and every part of the planning process, the Olympic Park Delivery Authority wanted a ground zero to work with, and that's what they got. You can see the same story at Burgess Park, where the Aylesbury estate is being redeveloped, or in the story of the Haygate estate at Elephant and Castle, now replaced with Elephant Park. Communities are awkward. They're invited to contribute, but if what they want doesn't fit with what's being proposed, they will have to get what they are given. At Burgess Park, alongside a decade-old fight against the council's redevelopment plans, which inevitably mean a net loss of social housing, there are ongoing disputes over how the park is used. In 2011, Southwark built a permanent barbecue area, which became hugely popular with the locals. And then in 2020, during the lockdown, supposedly on social distancing grounds, the facility was closed, and all calls to reopen it have been resisted. The park has been expensively refurbished, wonderful design by LDA, lots of community participation in that. Many local families have been relocated, and there's a different demographic emerging with the redevelopment. People who complained of feeling excluded or intimidated by these gatherings to eat and drink and sing and dance. I always think this reminds me of a Renoir. I don't know if you recognise the picture I've got in mind, but it's a very beautiful composition. At Elephant and Castle, where the old LCC Haygate estate has been redeveloped as Elephant Park, CGI again. It's interesting worlds. You sometimes think landscape, especially architects, you'd start to wonder about your grasp of reality when you spend all your time with CGI, which is so lifelike. It's a very weird world. Anyway, more CGI. There's Elephant Park. The community's wish to retain 122 mature London planes was granted, which is ironic given that the development was built including 25 acres of previous metropolitan open land that was owned by Southwark Council. But did they get the affordable homes that would allow them to stay where they and their parents had been born? No. And as one local resident exiled from the Haygate commented, they say they are creating communities, but they're not communities that I recognise. Well, gentrification is an old story. And I'm surprised by how often displaced people are gracious and philosophical about their loss. It's not quite what I want to talk about. Community is an overused word for an undervalued resource and an abused resource too, often taken for granted by decision makers and policymakers. Community participation often takes the form of resistance rather than collaboration, and its stance, initially at least, is that of the outsider with a bottom-up perspective, which is inevitably disruptive of top-down views and plans. Part of my thinking about this proposal when I talked to Annabelle, was it 6 months ago, was prompted by recollections of the campaign to save Stoke Park in Bristol in the 1980s, when I first met my friend Stuart Harding, recently been awarded an MBE, amazingly, not least because of that campaign. So this is Stoke Park. These are 3 photos from a book. Anyone who knows Bristol will recognise it. It sits beside the M32, and it's a Thomas Wright landscape that in the 1980s was in a fairly sorry state, part of the NHS estate. The campaign, had begun with Stuart and a group of residents of the nearby Loch Lees estate, which is at the time was boasted of as the largest council estate in Europe, was concerned with plans to level the top of the park to create school playing fields. Well, school playing field seems okay, but the need to create those new playing fields was because the original school fields, had been given to Hewlett Packard as part of a sweetener to tempt them to develop a new HQ on the edge of Bristol. That community group's experience was of evasiveness and even lying from local authority officers who did not welcome what they saw as interference. You wouldn't call it community interference, but that's exactly what it was. It takes 1,000 times more effort. Oh, sorry, that's not a mathematical calculation. That's a rhetorical flourish. But it takes a lot more effort for mere amateurs to get heard than professionals. Communities use the wrong language. They fume at the idiocy of process and procedure, and they fume at injustice. At Stoke Park, as we gradually built a case on historic landscape grounds, Thomas Wright was the key to the kind of thing we used to do. I remember Stuart remarking that before we found the link to the Wizard of Durham, the only argument that the local community had been able to raise was that they loved the place. An argument that, while of the highest value in human terms, has zero value in planning terms. What is it like to realise that the system does not recognise your views as legitimate or as material to planning decisions? There's a photo of Stoke Park. Now, this campaign was successful. To get heard requires petitions, letters to the press, to MPs, to local councillors, media campaigns, setting up public meetings, attending planning meetings, and appearing even at public inquiries. Thousands of hours, unpaid hours, are required for a community to gain some grudging recognition that they might have a point, might actually know something that the professionals don't. How mad does that sound? As an outsider, you have a steep learning curve just to get on the same page, to get into the same room, so that you can put your arguments the correct way, to channel outrage into language that can be accommodated by professionals. Communities for whom a place matters profoundly need a thick skin to deal with the 1,000 slights and rebuffs from people for whom this is just a job. And on top of that, you're the only one in the room not being paid. So for communities to participate in planning is a really hard ask, especially in a confrontational planning situation. But community participation is not easy in any area. Lottery grants, for example, often made and still do make community involvement in a project a criterion for a successful council bid. The HLF, as it was then the Lottery Fund, sparked a small industry of consultants writing community consultation plans, audience development plans, community engagement plans, strategies for hard-to-reach audiences, volunteering strategies, and the rest. All of them trying to square the circle that the communities most in need of engagement often had the least human, time, and financial resources required to engage. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat. In the last 25 years, as the idea of community participation has gathered momentum, local authorities have seen communities or volunteers as a resource. The rise of Friends of Parks groups has been a wonderful thing. But there's no escaping it's coinciding with the diminution of local authority resources. In some cases, volunteering has been encouraged while local authorities are seeking savings on their parks budget. And that's okay. People who love their parks are often more than willing to help out, but volunteering can be abused. And the signs of that are absence of support from the local authority, both practical and moral. That means, for example, not only access to tools, for example, and shelter, but also to advice when it's needed, or help with difficult situations such as antisocial behaviour. To be effective, to be rewarding, community engagement needs to be supported. It is not a cheap fix or an alternative to public spending on public goods. The great social scientist David Donaldson, who died in 2018, was absolutely on the nail when he wrote, "Meaningful community participation takes more civic leadership, not less." Friends of Parks groups very often find themselves having to navigate, I think is what I want, a transition from outsider to insider, from pressure group, able to express itself freely, if often unavailingly, from pressure group to partner. I used to see this a lot with the lottery-funded parks projects. A friends group might have spent years bashing the council about neglect or opposing a development. And if you check out Save Our Parks on Google, the battles are still continuing everywhere. And then from that position of being an outsider, a campaigning body, they're brought on board for a funding bid, and they find themselves at the table now as a valued stakeholder, but also one which has to make compromises. More conflicting still, their activities, which spring mainly from emotional ties, which are often quite complex, suddenly have to be quantified and commodified, literally given a cash value as partnership funding in the lottery bid. And this can be quite traumatic. And there's often a change in personnel in friends groups as they go from being awkward to being accommodating. Community initiatives often spring from a sense of exasperation at the failures of local or indeed national government. When people realise that the apparatus of the state will not provide what they need, they'd better take the initiative. These kind of community activists are everywhere, unsung treasures from all walks of life. An initiative, say, to simply start planting a bit of unused ground, which is the basic model of guerrilla gardening, can take place in a leafy suburb as well as a gritty urban lot. This is the Hawthorne, as I was saying, the Hawthorne Wildlife Triangle in Whitley Bay in Tyneside. I want to talk now about precariousness or precarity. I don't have to pronounce it, but it is a word coined at the beginning of the 20th century, precariousness and precarity, which is a word my children or my young adult offspring talk about. We are gradually coming to terms with the uncertainty of our futures and the insecurity of our present. a whole generation, that's my kids' generation, 20s to 30s, now identify themselves as part of the precariat in recognition of the absence of secure employment or secure accommodation. And for older generations, the idea of food security, empty shelves in the supermarkets, and of financial security, as inflation has eaten into real wages, savings, and disposable income, have both been brought into focus. That sense of precariousness is growing, and it finds an echo. It chimes with the nature of community gardens, many of which do not have any security of tenure and continue to exist under the threat of repossession and redevelopment. The original community gardens, I think, I'm thinking about the guerrilla gardens in New York, which were set up by the charismatic artist Liz Christie in the 1970s. She coined that name, guerrilla gardeners. They all lacked any kind of security of tenure when they were set up. It was in the midst of the great sort of financial crisis in New York, the abandonment of public services, soaring crime, urban dereliction and abandonment, and this city authorities on the point of bankruptcy. And that's when these horticulturalists, botanists, artists, anarchists, parents and grandparents decide to fight back. The very idea of guerrilla gardening was to challenge landowners, the owners of these lots, which is often the city authority, these derelict plots that were blighting neighborhoods, about their failure of stewardship. The gardens were political statements about that failure and about the need to empower local communities. And more, because they weren't about securing tenure, they were embodiments of an alternative to the dominant paradigm of capital and ownership. Some still survive. Liz Christie's original one still survives. It's even listed in their equivalent of the register, but most don't. But new gardens continue to be born. In the same decade, in 1976, the Meanwhile Garden in North Kensington, Kensal Road, was established. Like Liz Christie in New York, Jamie McCulloch was an artist who saw a derelict piece of land and set about making a garden. In 1976, a bit similar situation to New York. That was the year of the UK's bailout from the IMF, power cuts, rising inflation, unemployment, and North Kent at the time was one of the poorest areas in the country. The council owned the land, and they gave no assurances to McCulloch and his gang, but they allowed a temporary park to be built. And 48 years on, it's still there, but still with council redevelopment plans hanging over much, if not now all of the park. And in that meanwhile, it's become an integral part of the community, used by schools and by clubs. The name Meanwhile Gardens seems to me it's a powerful one. It evokes, of course, their provisional, potentially temporary status, but also a powerful sense of impatience, a restless urgency about making something happen. The word embraces a garden's precariousness and its impermanence, but it has this energy behind it as well. Groundwork, what you should call the Groundwork Trust, used the term for 4 small half-acre pop-up gardens in Belfast, all of which had only short leases when the work started. This is one in Connswater Street, I think in East Belfast. They used damaged plastic curbside recycling boxes to grow veg and fruit in. Oh, you can see them there with the in the foreground, as well as building raised beds. And they made compost from local food and garden waste, which the council provided them with. And what's interesting for me is the tone when Groundwork talks about these projects. They said, maybe new social housing will be built on the sites and we'll need to vacate. No big problem. We'll pick up our mobile garden and find a new derelict plot of land and continue growing. There's plenty to choose from. Beth Chato Nurseries are currently working on an explicitly temporary garden in the centre of Colchester. I think they call it a Meanwhile Garden as well. It's laid out on a site which has been earmarked for future development, and they're planting into a mix of gravelly soil and crushed hardcore from a neighbouring development. The point I want to make about both of these is that what we might traditionally think of as a characteristic of the urge to garden, which is to put down roots, is not part of this energy, this kind of dynamic. It seems to me it's very interesting that these are pop up, pack up, move away gardens as well as everything else. My favourite pop-up garden was Extinction Rebellion's garden on Waterloo Bridge in the spring of 2019. It was a defiant garden, a model for the future, not just of greening and pedestrianising the city, but of working together, sharing food, talking to strangers, and a lesson too in non-attachment, in learning to let go. In Berlin, my daughter was telling me about a garden established as a project for refugees, led by an Ethiopian gardener, DJ and filmmaker, Fetesh Terekagan. The Gartnerei Co-op campus lasted for only 3 years, from 2015 to 2018, before it was closed down by the council. Ironically, on the grounds of disturbing the nest of an owl. But he wrote a really interesting blog about it, in which he said, I'm going to quote this. Some things require careful planning and execution. Some projects start out as a means to acquaint and educate oneself with no regard to the outcome. What if you're working in a project whose explicit outcome is not known, let alone guesstimated? What if the people you've chosen to work with are the very people that society has claimed to have no place for? What if, in the end, all you get to learn is that given time and a space, it is people that are important, not gardens? So the inspiration for such gardens is not the familiar one, planting for tomorrow or an investment in the future, that famous old phrase, the happiness that is planting a tree under which you will not sit. On the contrary, these community gardens are actions, are gestures which embody defiance of things falling apart and celebrate the courage of accepting displacement and loss. These gardens are about coming to terms with uncertainty and insecurity. They're not about putting down roots as if the future could be relied upon. They are less about place than about people, about a community that comes together. And they're exercises in resilience and also possibly in relinquishment when the time comes. At some level, they give us the chance to practice being fugitive, rehearsing the possibility of becoming refugees. Not all gardens developed in response to social and economic crisis, like the 1970s, are such transient gestures. Some survive to become infrastructure. The story of the collapse of Detroit, the Motor City, which started in the 1990s and then cascaded after the 2008 financial crisis, when a white flight left whole neighborhoods to fall into dereliction, is well known, but no less dramatic for that. Post-industrial, depopulated, whole streets abandoned, ruined, and returning to nature. Today, there's a kind of equilibrium with large areas of former residential land being repurposed for urban farming. The civil rights activist Grace Lee Boggs juxtaposed what she called the illusions of industrial revival, sort of Donald Trump dream of bringing industry back, with the renewal of the city through urban gardens and related greening strategies. She said, "You can bemoan your fate, or as the African American elders taught, you can plant gardens." She spoke of the need to reimagine the concept of work as opposed to jobs. And she said, we need to take more responsibility for each other and for our community. She brought together community elders and young people to undertake planting community gardens, painting public murals, creating bike programs, hosting poetry workshops to express their new thoughts. And these activities, she hoped, could serve as a reconnection with earth and community, a need magnified by Detroit's search for renewal. So the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, set up in the 1990s, is still thriving, operating D-Town Farm, the largest of these urban farms, which grows fruit, vegetables, herbs for local farmers markets and wholesale customers. The economic model is not just cash-based. In addition, the D-Town Farm feeds 2,000 households for free from a 2-acre plot and an orchard of 200 trees. It also feeds its volunteer workers, of course. In the post-industrial city, agriculture and food growing is moving in, with over 120 different community gardens and urban farms, over several acres each. So I'm sort of shading into it already, but I want to talk really now about what I see as, and forgive me if this is not what you signed up for, but in the context of what I've said about community gardens and what their meanings are, I think I want to talk about gardens in a time of collapse, or maybe unraveling is a gentler, more palatable word. The evidence keeps mounting up, not just the unfolding chaos in our climate. I mean, look at what's happened in February. We haven't had a winter. It's been nearly 58, nearly 60 degrees in London, I read. The catastrophic collapse in biodiversity, and the systems on which life depends. The sense in which we're facing a future which is profoundly uncertain and frightening and dangerous is growing, especially among the young. And to go back to the point I made earlier on, here in the UK, not wanting to risk bathos, there's mounting evidence of chaos in our public services, which suggests to me that maybe they too are slowly collapsing. The very idea of a select committee looking at local authority financial distress is a sign of the times, and their conclusion that the present funding system is simply broken is very disturbing. And when they call on central government to inject an additional emergency 4 billion this year, it's 4 billion which is not going to be forthcoming. 14 long years of austerity have seen local authorities and other public funded agencies, the NHS, their ability to provide public services completely hollowed out. That doesn't just mean parks maintenance reduced to a skeleton service. It means youth services in crisis, social services in crisis, mental and community health services in crisis. This is daunting and maybe even traumatic for us. We're dealing not just with inconvenience, but with a kind of bereavement. Now, as always, it's good to think back or to consider history. So, Big for Victory in the beginning of the Second World War was a way to respond to a terrifying prospect of Nazism, invasion, violent death. And faced with those, many people responded to the invitation to start gardening. In the UK, by 1943, there were over 3.5 million allotments around the country. that grew over, I love this photo, over 1 million tons of vegetables, approximately 40% of the veg consumed that year. In response to a life-threatening emergency, gardening was an act of comfort and defiance. Who do you think you're kidding, Mr. Hitler? And above all, it was a practical step, something we could do. It's an extraordinary book by an American landscape architect called Kenneth Helpan, called Defiant Gardens, excuse me. And its subject is gardens created during wartime, not those dig for victory allotments, but gardens in the trenches of the Western Front during World War One, ghetto gardens in Europe during World War Two, prisoner of war gardens in prison war camps. And I want to share this amazing example I found when I was researching for this talk. Can you read that? Can you read the caption? Mohammed Ataya, a 31-year-old known as Abu Maher, tends to his plants on the rooftop of his damaged building in the Syrian rebel-held town of Arbin, on the outskirts of Damascus. Ataya, who was a professional soccer player before the war, cultivates seeds for sale. And it's 2017, March 2017. That's an amazing photo. Despite the labour and the dedication that went into making gardens like this, on the very limits of society tearing itself apart, these gardens were never permanent, and their impermanence is precisely what makes the humanity so poignant. In a 2020 essay called Companion Planting, the writer John Day describes his experience of helping to form the Leighton Boundary Garden in East London. He describes how in his area of London, every other street now hosts a pocket park or garden, or planters around each tree, tended by enthusiastic bands of volunteers. He's quite deprecating about this. He says, I quote, "It's easy to read this engagement with vegetable life as an anxious response to the overwhelming political and environmental turmoil of the times, a growing awareness of the terrors of industrial farming and planetary extinction, manifesting in a desire to eat local and live lightly." And he apologizes. He says, as a political response, gardening can feel like an indulgence, a distraction from more important struggles. I love what he says, but that seems very harsh to me. Building community and resilience and capacity seem as urgent to me as anything, as does learning to live lightly and learn to be happy with less. We may be used to seeing gardening, as he does, seeing as a sort of genteel activity. So it's easy to forget that gardening as control of land and control of the means of producing food has often been associated with radical challenges to dominant systems. Gardening, horticulture, and agriculture are all on the same spectrum, different only in degree. And it's worth reflecting on the common cause behind community gardens such as these and liberation movements across the globe, fighting for food sovereignty as part of a revolutionary struggle. And these are gardens, these guerrilla gardens in a city in collapse, and the defiant gardens of wartime, which challenge the dominant ethic of our culture of business as usual. In the UK, we can see that challenge in the long-established sharing, repair, reuse, recycle ethos of allotment gardens and allotment gardening. Allotment gardens historically have been underpinned by social rents and a traditional prohibition in the bylaws on the sales of produce, which de facto creates the unique gift economy of allotment sites. If anyone wants to ask about that, there's just thought another point, but I won't stop now. And it can also be seen, that same sort of challenge, I think, can be seen in the reclaiming and reimagining of public parks. enabled by the lottery grants that ran for 20 years from the mid-1990s. Gardening has been called a radical act. I wouldn't want to embarrass gardeners, but in some ways that's not an overstatement, not least because radical and radish have the same Latin root. Gardens can challenge the dominant paradigm. And I make no apology for the style of this poster. That's kind of the point. Even the graphics are the opposite of that shiny CGI graphic universe that so many of our decisions are made in. Community gardens, and especially gardening, offer us a response to this unraveling, to this crisis. It's really interesting to me that Berlin has such a vibrant culture of community gardening, of Gemeinschaftsgärten. Over 200 sites, which, like the guerrilla gardens on the Lower East Side, are now publicised as a tourist attraction in their own right. The most famous were the Prinzessinnengarten at Moritzplatz in Kreuzberg, which have recently developed a second site here on unused land in the St. Jacobi Cemetery in Neukölln. Some of these Gemeinschaftsgärten offer individual plots for rent. Others are gardened in common or a combination of the two. Almost all of them that I've seen use raised beds, containers, in recognition of their potentially temporary nature. They sometimes refer to themselves as mobile gardens. And most combine vegetable gardening with public access in the form of cafes and flea markets, performance areas, and programs of education and outreach with workshops, talks, and open days. The most beautiful of community gardens for me is the vast park created from the old Tempelhof airfield after flight stopped in 2008. 2 years later, the airfield was open to the public and saw 250,000 visitors in the first weekend. And since then, the park has thrived as a recreational space and also a location for some 250 community allotments around the edge, all growing in containers, but always still under the shadow of continuing proposals for partial redevelopment of the site. The repurposing is beautifully simple. No landscape design, no new infrastructure, just access and people coming together to find the new in the ruins of the old. I do sometimes wonder why Berlin and other German cities, where these Gemeinschaftsgarten, and my old O-level German lets me down, Gemeinschaftsgärten, it's a vigorous urban phenomenon. Community gardens focus again on food security, established with more or less official sanction and backing, and often thriving with little security of tenure. Their hold on Berliners' imaginations might be ascribed to the economic chaos of after reunification, but maybe also to some collective memory and trauma from the collapse of civic infrastructure after both world wars. Here in the UK, there is a well-established tradition of city farms and community garden initiatives, many of them members of Social Farms and Gardens, farmgarden.org. And most of these seem to have more security of tenure. And some are quite slick and well-connected, but most are pretty bottom-up, a bit rickety, very proudly make do and mend. Inspired by those New York hippies, guerrilla gardening, community gardening, and urban food growing initiatives have been around a long time in the UK, and they do seem to flourish during hard times. The 1970s, and then again through another rush since after 2010 with austerity. And there seems now to have been a sharp upturn inspired by COVID and lockdown. I'd like to talk a bit about that. In many ways, COVID has transformed our ideas of vulnerability. First, physically, to a mysterious killer disease you remember? And second, mentally, as we recognize the dangers of prolonged social isolation. And he gave us two sharp lessons. One, how insecure are the global food supply systems on which we depend. And secondly, for many of us, the discovery that the social contract aside, governments can fail in their responsibility to protect us. There's been some really interesting research on the coincidence of online searches for the term gardening and the first wave of the pandemic. They spiked together. Research covered 34 different countries and selected for the wide variety of location, ethnicity, wealth, and so on. The evidence suggested a significant number of people responded to the pandemic by turning to gardening. I remember how, and it's surprising, A, how long ago it feels, and B, how little we talk about it. I remember how during lockdown, people of all classes and backgrounds rushed to help each other at a local level. It was like I felt it was almost like a downburst of community feeling. That phenomenon where commuters will start to talk to each other when the train's delayed long enough or when the bus breaks down. Making scrubs for health workers, collecting prescriptions and shopping for the elderly, people flocking to provide food for food banks and other local community food networks. Much of that food came from community farms and gardens, and COVID saw a new surge in community garden projects. Let's go look at a couple here. So this is outside on the edge of Cambridge. Cambridge apparently is the most unequal city in the UK. Some serious health, wealth, and opportunity inequalities. So in 2020, this had just been acquired with a lease from the owners. A local group was setting up a market garden on 2 acres. They were called Co-Farm Cambridge. It's worth checking them out. And immediately a lockdown struck, and their first year's work was to help people struggling with food insecurity. By the end of lockdown, they were supplying 8 local community food hubs, as well as selling surplus at the farm gate. Now they've expanded to 7 acres, funded by grants from charities, business, and the council, and they're run by a board of very high-flying and well-connected trustees, and they've got big ambitions. I'm not going to say in contrast, but as well as that example, Co-Farm Cambridge, here's a community garden that had existed at Loughborough Park in Brixton since 2013, but during lockdown, they formed a group specially to grow vegetables to supply elderly and vulnerable families with food and plants. And they don't have individual plots here. They work in common for a share of the food and surplus available for the rest of the community. That idea of working for free and giving food away, which has roots in the old allotment culture I mentioned earlier, hints, I think, at new economic relationships growing since the economic shockwave of lockdown. In discovering personal vulnerability, people have recognized the primary importance of community, nurturing it or indeed building it. I want to end with a garden that's not a community garden at all. Trying to think of a sort of polar opposite. Prospect Cottage, Derek Jarman's garden on the shingle Dungeness. I'd like to think about it, though, in a particular way, not its artistic or horticultural interest, but its vulnerability. It's open to the blast of gales and storms and salt spray and the existential threat, you can see it in the background there, of the nuclear reactor. A garden, Jarman called it, with no fence other than the horizon. His book, Modern Nature, documents not only the endless losses of plants to the elements in such a harsh environment and their endlessly patient replacement, but also the emotional entanglement of the garden with the loss of friends to the AIDS epidemic. A garden without fences, without protection. It was a garden which embraced its own precariousness in the way I was talking about earlier. the opposite of a sanctuary, without wanting to sound melodramatic or actually positive. We are all gardening in the shadow of extinction, and I'd venture that in these modern times, Jarman understood that loss and fragility are okay, and in fact one and the same, with meaning and joy. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed. That's extraordinarily stimulating. And I hope, please remember to put your questions in the chat. This is your chance to interrogate Mr. Lambert on his remarkably influential talk, if I may say so. Can we start with a question from Helen Brown? Helen, do you want to unmask and ask it yourself, or should you want to let me read it for you?
No, you could, Helen, just read it out. It's fine.
Okay. Helen says, it is all a matter of the will of government. This is obviously looking at the earlier part of your talk. There has been a choice to impose austerity. If we could rebuild with the massive debt after World War II, then we could choose to do it now. Why not? I think a lot of us are asking that question.
Well, I absolutely agree, Helen. It is a choice. There's nothing inevitable about what there. It's not true that there is no alternative. Do you remember Tina, that phrase that Mrs. Thatcher used? There is no alternative. Of course, there's an alternative. There always is. And we've been making the wrong choices for a long time. I wouldn't even make it, I don't think, I'm not party political. I think a lot of these choices that New Labour made were carrying on a project started, I think, by Mrs. Thatcher, but it carried on pretty well unabated under Blair. I've got a lot of time for what Gordon Brown did. I think he did try to make some of the right choices, but anyway, yes, it doesn't have to be this way. And that's something we need to hold on to still. It doesn't have to be this way.
Can I then, Helen, with your permission, add a rider? How would you advise communities and individuals to tackle this problem and to create a climate of change, of can do, of yes, the alternatives will work? What advice have you got for us?
Well, I think I don't really want to advise anyone, but it seems to me, looking at the story that sort of emerged for me from looking at this subject, is that these gardens surge when things are bad. They come out of societal breakdown. New York in 1975, which was a day or week away from bankruptcy. Or what happened after 2008? What happened after 2010? Or 1970s in 1976 in the UK. So it's when these places are abandoned, when there is no prospect of the state providing for gardens, for public places of beauty, places, or security of food, when people are in that situation, that's when these places come. They don't come because they're permitted or even enabled by the state. And I think that's kind of what I meant when I said that, when I read that stuff about the state of local authority financial distress is the name of the report. It's like a bereavement. When you think of what's happened to the NHS, or even when you think of what's happened to the police or the fire service, public services which have been hollowed out, it kind of it goes beyond a kind of political point scoring. It's like bereavement, I think. And I think we need to call it that. That's how I feel about the loss of local authority parks departments, district nurses, and the rest. It's And I think the point about the community gardens is that those examples I looked at are made despite the absence of state support, local government support. It can come along later, it's very welcome, but the wellspring of the energy for a lot of those came from despairing that anything was going to happen. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that that they all came out of that sense of anger, loss, bewilderment, disorientation, poverty.
Mm. Do you think we've lost that?
Lost what?
The extreme emotions. Do you think now we aren't being as creative, though? Are there community gardens being created? Is society putting itself out to do these things, or have we all lapsed into a shrugging, can't do anything malaise?
No, I don't know. I mean, the number, it's like that essay by John Day. I mean, all over our towns and cities, especially our cities, there are community gardens springing up. It's incredible. I mean, it's thriving, but it's thriving partly because of lockdown and the damage that people intuited around lockdown. And I think also out of austerity, places which feel abandoned. In the end, people will start to do something, and that's amazing, and it's something to celebrate. So no, I've got huge faith in human creativity, in adversity. It just keeps coming. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to hear your optimism and think that we can still do it, because I do sometimes wonder, and I might come back to that. Michael writes, more of a comment than a question, I think, is, I remember with great pleasure and gratitude David's advice and support that enabled a small group of volunteers to save and regenerate the historic garden landscape of, here we go, and I have a Welsh accent at all, it's a northern one, not a southern one. Oh, no, I'm not even going to try it. You can see it in the chat. In Swansea for community benefit. I don't know if there's a story to tell there.
I think it must be Pensagar, but I can't.
Yeah,
let me just see if I can find the chat. Sorry.
Don't worry, it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was an amazing. I mean, I didn't do nothing compared to what was going on locally, but yeah. I mean, when I used to work for the Garden History Society, the cases that really fired me up were invariably ones where a community group was trying to resist damage to a cherished local place. Yeah, it's heroic what people do. That's what I meant by having, it's really tough on communities to get heard. The planning system is, and it's only got worse. The planning system is not an easy thing to penetrate, let alone influence. When you're an amateur, but that was the lesson I was trying to convey by talking about Stoke Park.
Thank you. Yeah. Ian Baggett says, so great to see someone steer away from the rhetoric of ownership that we see so much in the public realm, but the real issue of ownership of the land creates its own dynamic at the outset. Your point about friends groups in parks moving from lobbyists to valued stakeholder is key. But the decisions on funding the space will rest with the landowner. So even the level of stakeholder is still a few rungs down from where it should be on the old ladder of engagement. Any thoughts on that one?
It's right. Yeah.
Go on.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just think I think what I find very interesting is the community attitude. I recognize it from people. I can remember back at that Stoke Park thing. And I won't swear, but that feeling that just says, bugger it. We don't own the land, we don't have tenure, but we're still just going to do it.
Yeah.
And that's powerful because you don't know where that will lead.
Yeah.
And certainly what it does, wherever it leads, is it empowers the community. So quite often it's about not waiting for everything to be in place, not waiting to be given the keys. I mean, there's a nice example of that co-farm Cambridge. That was, everything was in place. They got the lease, they'd got the trustees, they must have had a business plan and so on. But a lot of these community gardens are done on the fly, and things still happen. So
yeah,
I suppose that's where I find a lot of encouragement.
Helen Brown says we all need to be advocates in our communities, and I think one should stress the all. Perhaps a bit of a downer for me, but you mentioned learning to let go and resilience, and the excitement and the rush of blood to the head when you start out to say, we want to do this. We may not own the land, but we can be very creative and community helpful. But I wondered if you'd any experience of community groups as they mature, as their landscape matures, which suffer from internal problems rather than external pressures. Perhaps a single dominant individual, a dictator figure, who drives away members who may have lost the will to fight the devil within, having already tackled the devil without. I don't know if you have any experience on that. Sorry.
Oh my God, yes.
How negative can I be?
Community groups are soap operas, and I don't know any community group that doesn't lurch from one crisis to the next, and a lot of its personalities. And I just think, that's just in the nature of things. They aren't stable entities. I mean, very often you will get someone who's been. Did someone mention? Sorry, earlier on, someone being involved in a project for 30 years. I think it was something Annabelle said. But the occasion you do get that sort of thing. But no, and I think they're always riven with shifting up alliances and allegiances and exasperations, because A, they're not paid, B, they care a lot, and C, it's a pressured job. It's never easy to run a community group because for those three reasons alone, relationships get strained. Oh.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That comforts me a great deal. Peter asks, do you think once the community garden gets formalised, as the Cambridge example seems to have been, is the local community and the haphazardness that created the garden in the first place, has that been lost? Does one just accept this is inevitable change?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think I mentioned briefly that sort of how friends groups, for example, we often find something having to sort of navigate a transition from being a pressure group outside the tent and able to say anything in terms of bashing the council. And then success is to be rewarded with a place inside the tent and find yourself in a different place, requiring different skills, different energies. So that's for certain. There's one kind of evolution, and the other one, yes, of course. I mean, I know with our farm here that you have people who are pioneers, who are really good at setting things up, who've got that kind of vision and energy, but they may not enjoy being managers once things have been achieved and move on to a sort of more day-to-day sort of basis. And so that's another way in which there are transitions that happen. So yes, I do think things keep changing, and it's okay, because there are other people who've got different skills who can move in and help and take things forward. But yeah, those sort of dynamics are absolutely inevitable, but they're not. It's not a bad thing. It's just hard work.
Absolutely. Yeah, different times, different people, different
Yeah.
skills.
Yeah.
Peter, do shout if you want to come back on that question. There's no pressure on you to do so if you prefer to stay more anonymous. I'll give you a chance to respond if you wish to. I think probably that has exhausted us from the sheer intellectual challenge and exhausted our questions. So I did promise you I would ask you one last one. Our title is Community Landscape, Top Down or Bottom Up. Would you care to give your view on that latter question?
Well, you warned me about this one. I thought it's like picking a side. So I'm definitely on the side of bottom up. You might not be surprised to know that. But I hope I've sort of shown some awareness of how difficult that is. The system is not, and someone like Ian has been involved in this like me for so long in navigating a way through, on the one hand, sort of theoretical welcome for the bottom-up view. Every politician will say how much they value the community's perspective, and a system which is still basically top-down. It's like listening to central government talking about local democracy, local decision making over this crisis in finance. It's entirely up to local authorities how they allocate their budgets. Well, it's not, because over 85% of the money is controlled by central government. So power is always being hoarded more and more centrally. At the same time, which is what does your head in, as we're being told that there's more local democracy, more local decision making, more community participation. So it's a complete. It is very difficult, but I'm definitely on the side of bottom up. I just appreciate how hard it is to push upwards that way.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And there are inevitably some thank yous coming in from the audience as well. One last one from Annabelle. Oh, no. Oh, yes, another thank you's just come in. Annabelle says, this is the archivist in her talking, do these community gardens get documented?
Well, it's a good question. The short answer, Annabelle, is I think nothing much gets documented these days because so much is evanescent. Everything's on email and accessible in digital forms, which will disappear in 25 years' time. So there are some very interesting. You can find archives, but I'm afraid a lot of the archives for community gardens are in a box in someone's back room or in their garage getting damp. It's not collected. It would be good to raise with the community farms umbrella group I mentioned. It's called farm.org, city farm. It's a good question. It's a good question.
Well, and that's a good answer as well. Thank you. Annabelle, are you there? Because I shall hand back to you anyway if you want to follow up on your question. And you're the chair.
David, that was fabulous. Can I just ask, have we reached rock bottom yet? Peak community garden building or initiating? Have we got to the bottom of the rot? No, not the rot. Are we in the sink? Are we at the bottom of the sea? We got another 10 years.
Do you mean economically and socially, or do you mean in terms of community gardens?
In terms of yes, economically and socially, and the springboard of the rise of like everywhere community gardens.
No, I think things are falling apart. It's not something that I'm part of a generation that thought that things would fall apart, but in some way in the future, and probably in other countries rather than where we are. But you can see the evidence all around. So it's progressing. To answer your question, I think I don't know how long that correlation between a sense of crisis and the creativity required to say go and occupy some land and start growing vegetables. I don't know whether that holds, how long that holds. I mean, at the moment you can see there are twin spikes: economic crisis and those community gardens. I mean, I might be oversimplifying, but whether that holds, well, maybe it does. I mean, look at that guy in Syria. I mean, oh my God. So I don't know how long it holds, but I think that the human need for community and to garden is pretty profound. I think it's as things fall apart, those energies are being released, which is good.
I suppose with the Dig for Britain was, Dig for Victory was Lord somebody or other, wasn't it? It was a parliamentary initiative.
It was. But I think it's easy to forget, isn't it? Especially when I quoted, "Who do you think they're kidding, Mr. Hitler?" Like it was all Dad's army. But, in 1939 or 1940, especially if you're in the southeast, you were living with the prospect of imminent invasion and very real likelihood of imprisonment, violent death, losing everything you had, being turned into we forget that, how desperate that threat was. And it's really interesting to me that gardening, chimed with that sense of crisis. Yeah.
Well, I think this has been fantastic, David. Thank you so much. Thank you for ignoring our conversation. No, you didn't ignore it at all, actually. I think you've done much more than I thought you would, or whatever. But not. No, I must be polite. Sorry, I was trying to be polite, and I thought I might get it out the wrong way. I thought that was fantastic. I really liked how you bit into community, really sort of unraveled it all, and I think there is so much fluff, very easy language, and I love also your interest and feel for words. I think that's so important and something that we don't often get. Thank you so much. I think brilliant. I think we'll have to have you back to talk about undertaking now.
maybe over a glass of wine. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you for being here, everyone.